In the unforgiving world of military training, where brotherhood is forged through blood, sweat, and shared sacrifice, there exists an unwritten code that protects the strong and silences the weak. But what happens when that very code becomes the weapon used to destroy someone who dared to dream beyond their circumstances?
Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her biggest enemy wouldn't be the grueling physical challenges of Navy SEAL training, the bone-crushing exhaustion, or even the fear of failure. Her greatest battle would come from the very people who were supposed to stand beside her as brothers in arms.
In a world where respect is earned through performance and character, she would discover that some prejudices run deeper than any ocean trench the SEALs would ever dive into. This is the story of how a group of elite military recruits learned that their actions don't just echo in the training halls, but reverberate through the chain of command all the way to the top. It's about the moment when a seasoned SEAL commander decided that some lessons can only be taught through consequences that cut as deep as the wounds they were meant to heal. What started as cruel jokes and dismissive laughter would soon transform into a reckoning that none of them saw coming.
Because in the military, every action has a reaction, and sometimes that reaction comes from the most unexpected source, with the power to change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Center as Sarah Mitchell stepped off the transport bus, her military-issued duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The salty ocean breeze carried with it the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, but also something else, the unmistakable tension that seemed to permeate every inch of this legendary training facility. At 24, Sarah had already proven herself in ways that most people twice her age never would.
She had graduated summa cum laude from the Naval Academy, excelled in her initial military assignments, and scored in the top percentile on every physical and mental evaluation that had brought her to this moment. Yet as she looked around at the intimidating concrete buildings and obstacle courses that would become her world for the next several months, she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach.
It wasn't fear of the training that concerned her. Sarah had been preparing for this physically and mentally for years.
She could run a 6-minute mile, complete more pull-ups than most of her male counterparts, and had already proven her tactical intelligence in real-world situations during her previous deployments. What worried her was something she had encountered throughout her military career, but had hoped might be different here, among the supposed elite of the Navy. As she made her way toward the intake building, she became acutely aware of the stares following her every step. Groups of male recruits, all looking like they had been carved from granite and seasoned by years of preparation, stopped their conversations to watch her pass. Some expressions showed curiosity, others skepticism, but a few displayed something that made her jaw clench with familiar frustration, open contempt. The intake process was a blur of paperwork, medical checks, and briefings that lasted most of the morning. Sarah found herself assigned to training class 847, a group of 32 recruits who would either emerge as Navy SEALs or wash out in the attempt. As she entered the barracks that would be her home, she quickly realized that she would be the only woman among 31 men. Her bunk assignment was in the middle of the long room, surrounded on all sides by recruits who had clearly already begun forming their social hierarchies during the few days they had been there before her arrival. As she began organizing her gear with military precision, the conversations around her grew quieter, but she could still catch fragments of whispered comments. "Can't believe they're really going through with this social experiment," muttered a voice from her left. She glanced over to see Jake Morrison, a former college football player from Texas whose massive frame made even the standard military bunk look small. His comment was directed toward his bunkmate, Tony Ricci, a wiry Italian-American from Boston, whose reputation as a troublemaker had apparently preceded him to SEAL training. "Give it a week," Tony responded, not bothering to lower his voice significantly. "She'll be crying her way back to whatever desk job she came from. This isn't a place for diversity quotas." Sarah kept her face carefully neutral as she continued unpacking, but her hands tightened slightly around the rolled-up sleeping bag she was placing on her bunk. She had heard variations of these comments throughout her military career and had learned that responding emotionally only provided ammunition for her critics. From across the room, she caught the eye of Marcus Thompson, an African-American recruit from Detroit whose quiet intensity had already marked him as someone to watch. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod, not quite encouragement, but acknowledgement. It was more support than she had expected, and less than she had hoped for. The first few days of training were a carefully orchestrated combination of psychological pressure, physical exhaustion, and mental challenges designed to weed out anyone who lacked the complete dedication necessary to become a SEAL. Sarah threw herself into every task with the focused determination that had carried her through every previous challenge in her life. During the endless physical training sessions, she kept pace with the group during runs, matched their performance in calisthenics,
and pushed through obstacle courses with the efficiency that surprised even some of the instructors. But rather than earning respect from her fellow recruits, her competence seemed to fuel their resentment.
"Must be nice having the instructors go easy on you," Jake commented after a particularly brutal session of log carries, where Sarah had been one of the few recruits not to falter under the crushing weight of the telephone poles they were required to transport across the beach. The comment stung because it was completely untrue. If anything, Sarah had noticed that the instructors seemed to push her harder than the others, as if testing whether she would use her gender as an excuse or ask for special consideration. She never did, but that didn't stop the whispered accusations from her fellow trainees. Tony Ricci seemed to have appointed himself as the unofficial leader of the anti-Sarah faction. During meals, he would make jokes just loud enough for her to hear about political correctness ruining the teams, and wonder aloud whether the standards had been lowered to accommodate certain recruits. His comments were always carefully crafted to avoid direct confrontation, while maximizing their psychological impact. The breaking point came during the third week of training, during what the instructors called surf torture, a brutal exercise where recruits were required to lie in the freezing Pacific Ocean surf until ordered to move. The exercise was designed to test mental fortitude as much as physical endurance, and it was during these moments of shared suffering that most SEAL classes began to bond as a unit. But Sarah's class was different. As they lay in the churning icy water, shivering uncontrollably while waves crashed over their bodies, she could hear muttered comments from the recruits around her. "This is what we get for letting girls play soldier," someone whispered during a brief lull in the instructor's orders. "Maybe if she quits, we can get back to real training," another voice added. The comments continued throughout the exercise, a constant undercurrent of harassment designed to make her feel isolated and unwelcome. Sarah forced herself to focus on the horizon, using every mental technique she had learned to block out the psychological warfare being waged by her own teammates. When the exercise finally ended and they were allowed to return to shore, Sarah's lips were blue with cold and her entire body was numb, but she had outlasted several of her male counterparts who had been pulled from the surf by instructors concerned about hypothermia. Yet even this demonstration of her resilience only seemed to fuel more resentment. "Bet she's getting extra medical attention," Tony muttered as they walked back toward the barracks, loud enough for Sarah to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if confronted. That evening, as Sarah lay in her bunk trying to warm up and recover from the day's brutality, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Several recruits were discussing a plan to make her training experience so miserable that she would voluntarily withdraw from the program. "We just need to make it clear that she doesn't belong here," Jake was saying. "Nothing that would get us kicked out, just enough pressure to help her realize she's made a mistake." "I've got some ideas," Tony added with a cruel laugh. "By the time we're done, she'll be begging to go back to whatever easy assignment she had before." The conspiracy was being planned just 20 feet away from where she lay, and Sarah realized that her biggest challenge wouldn't be the brutal physical training, the sleep deprivation, or the constant pressure from instructors. It would be surviving the systematic campaign of harassment from the very people who were supposed to become her brothers in arms. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the ocean waves that would become the soundtrack to her ordeal, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her time in SEAL training. She would not quit. She would not give them the satisfaction of breaking her spirit or forcing her to abandon her dreams. But what Sarah didn't know was that her tormentors were about to escalate their campaign in ways that would ultimately catch the attention of someone who had the power to change everything. Someone who had been watching from the shadows and taking careful note of everything that was happening in Training Class 847. Commander Marcus Webb had been overseeing SEAL training for 15 years, and in that time he had seen every possible variation of human nature under the extreme pressure of the program. He had watched strong men break under stress, seen unlikely heroes emerge from the most unexpected candidates, and learned to recognize both genuine character and its absence. What he was beginning to observe in Training Class 847 disturbed him more than any failure of physical performance or mental toughness he had ever witnessed. The systematic harassment he was documenting would soon force him to make decisions that would forever change not just Sarah's experience, but the entire culture of how future SEAL candidates would be expected to treat their fellow warriors. The storm was brewing, and none of the recruits who were plotting against Sarah could have imagined the consequences that were about to engulf them all. The harassment campaign against Sarah began subtly, with small acts designed to chip away at her confidence and make her daily existence as uncomfortable as possible. It started with her gear mysteriously disappearing or being tampered with. Her carefully maintained equipment would be found dirty or damaged, forcing her to spend her precious few free hours cleaning and repairing items that should have been ready for inspection. Tony Ricci had proven himself to be particularly creative in his methods of psychological warfare. He would wait until Sarah was in the shower facility, then organize the other recruits to hide her clean uniforms, leaving her scrambling to find appropriate clothing before morning formation. When she would finally locate her gear, it would often be soaking wet or covered in sand, forcing her to appear for inspection in substandard condition. The instructors focused on the intense training regimen, initially attributed these incidents to the general chaos and stress of SEAL training. Recruits losing or damaging equipment was not uncommon during the grueling program, and Sarah's complaints were dismissed as part of the normal adjustment challenges that all candidates faced. But Commander Webb was beginning to notice patterns that troubled him deeply. During his regular reviews of training footage and instructor reports, he observed behaviors that went far beyond the typical hazing that had been part of military training for generations. What he was witnessing was a systematic campaign designed specifically to target one individual based on characteristics that had nothing to do with their ability to serve as a SEAL. The physical sabotage was bad enough, but the psychological warfare was even more insidious. During team exercises, Sarah would find herself deliberately excluded from planning sessions. When she would attempt to contribute tactical suggestions, often demonstrating superior knowledge and strategic thinking, her ideas would be dismissed or ignored entirely, only to be discovered and praised when suggested later by one of her male teammates. Jake Morrison had developed a particularly cruel habit of publicly questioning Sarah's performance in front of the entire training class. After exercise sessions where she had clearly excelled, he would make comments like, "I wonder if the times are being recorded accurately for everyone," or, "It's interesting how some people seem to have more energy than others." His implications were clear to everyone present, suggesting that Sarah was receiving special treatment or that her achievements were somehow illegitimate. The most devastating aspect of the campaign was how it isolated Sarah from potential allies within the training class. Several recruits who might have been inclined to support her, or simply treat her fairly, were intimidated by the social pressure created by the ringleaders. Marcus Thompson, who had initially shown some signs of being willing to acknowledge Sarah's competence, gradually withdrew into neutral silence rather than risk becoming a target himself. During the 4th week of training, the harassment took a more dangerous turn. The class was participating in combat diving exercises where proper equipment function could literally be a matter of life and death. Sarah discovered that her diving gear had been tampered with in a way that would cause her air supply to malfunction during the underwater portions of the exercise. The sabotage was sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but would fail under the pressure conditions of actual diving. If Sarah had not conducted her own thorough equipment check, a practice she had adopted out of growing paranoia about her gear, she could have faced a life-threatening emergency underwater. When she reported the incident to the instructors, she was told that equipment failures were part of the training experience and that SEALs needed to be prepared for situations where their gear might not function perfectly. The suggestion that her equipment had been deliberately sabotaged was dismissed as paranoia, brought on by training stress. But Commander Webb had been watching more carefully than anyone realized. The diving incident had been captured on underwater cameras used for training evaluation, and his review of the footage showed clear evidence that Sarah's gear had been accessed by other recruits in a manner inconsistent with normal equipment maintenance or preparation. The commander began conducting his own investigation, reviewing security footage from the barracks and training areas. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment that went far beyond anything he had encountered in his years of overseeing SEAL training. The evidence showed Tony Ritchie and Jake Morrison working together to orchestrate elaborate schemes designed to make Sarah's training experience as difficult as possible. They had recruited several other recruits into their campaign, creating a hostile environment that violated every principle of teamwork and mutual support that SEAL training was designed to foster. Meanwhile, the pressure on Sarah continued to intensify. During the notorious Hell Week, the most brutal portion of SEAL training where recruits are pushed to their absolute physical and mental limits, the harassment reached its peak. Sleep-deprived and pushed beyond normal human endurance, Sarah faced not only the official challenges of the training, but also additional sabotage from her own teammates. Her assigned partners during boat exercises would deliberately fail to coordinate properly, causing her team to struggle with tasks that required perfect synchronization. During the grueling log carries that were a hallmark of Hell Week, she would find herself carrying disproportionate weight as teammates would subtly shift their portions of the load onto her shoulders. The psychological warfare became even more intense during the sleep deprivation phases of Hell Week. When recruits were finally allowed brief rest periods, Sarah would find that her sleeping area had been sabotaged, sand poured into her sleeping bag, her pillow soaked with cold water, or her rest area contaminated with substances that would make sleep impossible. Through it all, Sarah refused to quit. Her performance remained consistently strong. often superior to many of her harassers. But the constant stress of fighting battles on multiple fronts was beginning to take its toll. She found herself becoming increasingly isolated, unable to trust anyone in her training class, and exhausted from having to constantly guard against sabotage while also meeting the enormous demands of the training itself. The breaking point came during a night navigation exercise where proper teamwork was essential for success. Sarah's assigned partner was Tony Ritchie, who had been instructed by the cadre to work with her on a complex mission that would test both their individual skills and their ability to function as a unit. Instead of focusing on the mission, Tony spent the entire exercise making crude comments about Sarah's presence in the program and her capabilities as a potential SEAL. He deliberately led their team off course, ignored her correct navigation suggestions, and generally sabotaged their mission in ways that would reflect poorly on both of their performance evaluations. When they failed to reach their objective on time, Tony immediately blamed Sarah's inability to keep up and her lack of focus under pressure. His performance was so convincing that even some instructors began to question whether Sarah was truly capable of meeting the standards required for SEAL teams. But unknown to the recruits, Commander Webb had been monitoring the exercise through advanced surveillance equipment that captured not only their movements but also their conversations. The audio recordings provided clear evidence of Tony's deliberate sabotage and his systematic campaign to undermine Sarah's performance. That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion, she had no idea that her ordeal was about to take a dramatic turn. Commander Webb had seen enough, and his investigation had uncovered evidence that would soon lead to consequences that none of the recruits could have anticipated. The next morning brought an announcement that would forever change the dynamic of Training Class 847. Commander Webb appeared unexpectedly during morning formation, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every recruit. His expression was grimmer than any of them had ever seen, and there was an intensity in his demeanor that suggested something significant was about to happen. Training Class 847, he announced in a voice that carried across the formation area. There will be some changes to your training schedule today. Certain members of this class have been selected for individual performance reviews that will take place immediately following morning chow. Sarah felt her heart sink, assuming that she was about to be dismissed from the program based on the previous night's failed navigation exercise. She had no way of knowing that Commander Webb's performance reviews would actually be something entirely different. Confrontations that would expose the truth about what had been happening in Training Class 847 and force her tormentors to face consequences they had never imagined possible. The reckoning was about to begin, and the recruits, who had spent weeks systematically trying to destroy Sarah's dreams, were about to discover that their actions had not gone unnoticed by someone with the power to ensure that justice would be served in ways they could never have anticipated. The individual performance reviews began immediately after morning chow, but they were unlike anything the recruits had experienced during their time in SEAL training. Instead of the usual physical challenges or tactical evaluations, they found themselves seated across from Commander Webb in a sterile conference room, facing a man whose calm demeanor masked an intensity that made the room feel smaller than it actually was. Tony Ritchie was called in first, his usual cocky confidence intact as he entered the room. He had no reason to suspect that this meeting would be anything other than a routine evaluation, possibly even an opportunity to voice his concerns about having a female recruit in the program. He settled into the chair across from Commander Webb with the relaxed posture of someone who believed he was among allies. "Recruit Ritchie," Commander Webb began, his voice steady and professional. "I want to discuss your performance over the past several weeks. Specifically, your performance as a teammate and your adherence to the values that we expect from potential Navy SEALs." Tony's expression remained confident, but something in the commander's tone made him shift slightly in his seat. "Yes, sir. I believe I've been performing well in all areas of training." Commander Webb reached across the desk and activated a tablet, the screen facing Tony. "I'd like you to watch something with me." The video began playing, and Tony's face went pale as he realized what he was seeing. The underwater camera footage from the diving exercise showed him clearly tampering with Sarah's equipment in a manner that could have resulted in a life-threatening emergency. The timestamp and high-definition quality left no room for doubt about what had occurred or who was responsible. "Can you explain to me what you're doing in this footage, Recruit Ritchie?" Commander Webb's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of controlled fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. Tony's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Sir, I was checking her equipment to make sure it was safe." "I see." Commander Webb paused the video and leaned forward. "And would you consider tampering with a teammate's life support equipment in a way that could cause it to fail underwater to be part of ensuring safety?"
The silence stretched on for nearly a minute before Tony finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir. Let's watch some more footage, shall we?" Commander Webb activated another video, this one showing the barracks area during the night when Sarah's gear had been repeatedly sabotaged. The infrared cameras captured everything with crystal clarity, Tony and Jake working together to hide equipment, contaminate sleeping areas, and orchestrate the systematic harassment campaign. As video after video played, documenting weeks of deliberate sabotage and harassment, Tony's entire demeanor crumbled. The confident bully who had terrorized Sarah for weeks was replaced by a frightened young man who was beginning to realize the magnitude of his actions and their potential consequences. "Recruit Richie," Commander Webb said when the videos ended. "In my 15 years of overseeing SEAL training, I have never encountered behavior as disgraceful as what you have demonstrated. The men and women who earn the SEAL Trident are expected to be warriors who would die for their teammates. You have shown that you are willing to potentially kill a teammate for reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to serve their country." Tony tried to speak, but Commander Webb continued. "You are immediately dismissed from SEAL training. You will be transferred to a different duty assignment, and a full report of your conduct will be placed in your permanent military record. Your security clearance is being reviewed, and you may face additional disciplinary action depending on the outcome of the formal investigation that is now being initiated." The weight of his actions finally seemed to hit Tony as he realized that his military career was effectively over. "Sir, please. I made a mistake. I can change. I can do better." "You had the opportunity to do better every single day for the past month," Commander Webb replied. "You chose instead to engage in behavior that violated every principle we hold sacred in the SEAL teams. Your conduct has been not only disgraceful but potentially criminal. You are dismissed." Jake Morrison's session followed a similar pattern, with Commander Webb presenting video evidence of his participation in the harassment campaign and his role as one of the primary instigators. Jake's dismissal was equally swift and comprehensive, with the same consequences that would follow him for the rest of his military career. But Commander Webb wasn't finished. Every recruit who had participated in or enabled the harassment faced individual sessions where their actions were documented and discussed. Some received formal reprimands and additional training on military values and proper conduct. Others, whose participation had been more extensive, were removed from the program entirely. The recruits who had remained neutral or had been intimidated into silence faced different conversations. Commander Webb made it clear that while their behavior hadn't been as egregious as the ringleaders, their failure to report the harassment or stand up for a teammate was also unacceptable for future SEALs. The SEAL teams depend on absolute trust between team members, he told each of them. When you allow a teammate to be systematically attacked and do nothing to stop it, you demonstrate that you cannot be trusted to have their back when lives are on the line. Marcus Thompson, who had shown some initial signs of wanting to support Sarah, but had withdrawn under social pressure, received a particularly pointed conversation about moral courage and the difference between being a bystander and being a true teammate. The most surprising session was reserved for Sarah herself. When she entered the conference room expecting to be dismissed from the program, she instead found Commander Webb with a completely different demeanor than she had ever seen before. "Recruit Mitchell," he began, "I owe you an apology. The harassment you have endured over the past month should never have been allowed to continue as long as it did. While we were conducting our investigation and gathering evidence, you were forced to endure conditions that were completely unacceptable." She had prepared herself for dismissal, for accusations of being unable to handle the pressure, for suggestions that she wasn't suited for SEAL training. She had not prepared for an apology from one of the most respected commanders in naval special warfare. "Sir, I don't understand. What you have demonstrated over the past month goes far beyond the physical and mental toughness we look for in SEAL candidates." Commander Webb continued, "You have shown extraordinary resilience, integrity, and dedication while facing challenges that were never meant to be part of this training program. Your performance under these circumstances has been nothing short of exceptional." He leaned forward, his expression serious but supportive. "Sarah, the harassment you faced was systematic, dangerous, and completely contrary to everything we stand for in the SEAL teams. The fact that you continue to perform at such a high level while dealing with that additional pressure shows a level of character that is rare in any candidate, male or female." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but these were tears of relief and validation, rather than frustration and despair. "Thank you, sir. I wasn't sure anyone had noticed what was happening." "We noticed," Commander Webb assured her. "And we documented everything. The recruits responsible for this harassment are facing consequences that will follow them for the rest of their military careers.
Their behavior was not only unprofessional but potentially criminal, and it will be treated as such. He handed her a folder containing official documentation of the investigation and the actions taken against her harassers. I want you to understand that their dismissal from this program has nothing to do with your presence here and everything to do with their failure to live up to the standards we expect from potential SEALs. They were not removed to protect you. They were removed because they demonstrated that they lack the character necessary to earn the trident. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Commander Webb outlining the changes that would be implemented in the training program to prevent similar incidents in the future. New protocols for reporting harassment, additional training on military values and team cohesion, and enhanced monitoring systems were all being put into place. The SEAL teams are evolving, he explained, and that evolution includes welcoming qualified candidates regardless of gender, race, or any other factor that doesn't impact their ability to serve.
What happened to you over the past month represents the worst aspects of military culture that we are actively working to eliminate.
When Sarah finally left the conference room, she felt as though an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
For the first time since arriving at SEAL training, she could focus entirely on the official challenges of the program without having to constantly guard against sabotage from her own teammates. The remaining members of Training Class 847 found themselves in a dramatically different environment. With the ringleaders gone, and clear expectations established about proper conduct, the group began to function as an actual team for the first time. The recruits who had previously been intimidated into silence began to interact with Sarah as they would with any other teammate, and several even apologized for their previous behavior. Marcus Thompson approached Sarah after the evening meal on the day of the dismissals. "I want to apologize," he said quietly. "I should have spoken up weeks ago. I should have had your back from the beginning." Sarah appreciated the apology, but what meant more to her was seeing the genuine respect in his eyes, respect that was based on her performance and character, rather than any social pressure or official mandate. The remainder of SEAL training proved to be every bit as challenging as Sarah had expected, but now she could face those challenges alongside teammates who supported her, rather than against enemies who wanted to destroy her. She excelled in the remaining phases of training, earning recognition not as the female SEAL candidate, but simply as one of the strongest performers in her class. When Training Class 847 finally graduated, Sarah was among the top performers, having earned her place through the same demanding standards that had been applied to every SEAL candidate before her. The trident she received represented not only her own achievement, but also a victory for the principles of merit, character, and true teamwork that the SEAL teams were supposed to embody. Commander Webb watched the graduation ceremony with particular satisfaction, knowing that the events of the past months had led to changes that would benefit not only future female candidates, but all recruits who might face harassment or discrimination. The systematic reforms implemented as a result of Sarah's experience would create a training environment more focused on developing true warriors rather than perpetuating outdated prejudices. Years later, when Sarah had established herself as one of the most respected operators in her SEAL team, she would often reflect on those difficult weeks during training. The harassment had been devastating at the time, but it had also revealed the character of everyone around her, both the worst and the best aspects of military culture. Most importantly, it had shown her that even in the most challenging environments, there are always people in positions of authority who are watching, evaluating, and ready to act when principles are at stake. Commander Webb's intervention had not only saved her career, but it also sent a clear message throughout naval special warfare that harassment and discrimination would not be tolerated, regardless of tradition or social pressure. The ripple effects of those consequences extended far beyond Training Class 847, creating a new standard for how all military personnel were expected to treat their teammates. Sarah's ordeal had become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit countless future service members who deserved to be judged solely on their ability to serve their country with honor and distinction.